Right now, as we know, as a result of the failure to develop national policies, the United States is experiencing the most catastrophic uh, results as a result of the COVID-19 uh, uh, pandemic. We also face climate change where at the moment, and it's going to get worse, one person every 24 minutes in the world is driven away from their home, either by violence or climate change or violence arising from climate change. So this is a huge existential problem that is affecting the entire world. It's now estimated that by the end of the century, about 13 million Americans will be climate refugees. That's internal migration, away from the coast mostly, and away from rivers, coastal areas. So we are facing a huge change that is occurring in our culture without any real understanding of how it is all linked together and what its implications are. We talk about it day to day, about the failure of the ambulance services and that sort of thing, but we don't really think about it overall. And I want to suggest that that is because we do not recognize the role of collective consciousness. If you think about it, culture is the result of collective intention. It's the reason why the Japanese and the Italians cook eggplants very differently, because culture is created by individual choices. And we are currently at a place where we are just seriously beginning in our culture to accept the idea that consciousness is primary and causal, as Max Planck described it in 1931. And if we're going to deal correctly with what is coming, we need to recognize this idea of consciousness. We know from the research, I'm an experimentalist, so everything I know is from experiments. I'm not a theoretician. I'm just a guy that does experiments and measures objectively verifiable outcomes, or reads what other people do in that area. What is clear is that violent change succeeds only 25% of the time and is short-lived, whereas nonviolent change succeeds 75% of the time and is enduring. Now, why is that? And the answer is because nonviolent change is inclusive in nature and causes linkages between people. It's a kind of heart connection, to describe it in a sort of normal words. Whereas violent change is exclusive because it creates them and us. So how are we as a culture, and how is the world as a humanitarian culture going to get through climate change and the pandemics, of which the current one is just the first? Very few people seem to recognize that we have these pandemics about every 10 years. For instance, the influenza pandemic of 56 to 58 killed about 2 million people worldwide and about 60 to 70,000 in the United States. The H3N2 influenza that came about 10 years later in 68 killed 1 million people worldwide, about 100,000 in the United States. The HIV pandemic has killed 36 million people worldwide, about 675,000 in the United States. The H1N1 influenza 2009, 2010 killed up somewhere between 200,000, 575,000 in the world, about 12,469 in the United States. So we have these things regularly, and the research that is being done by people who study viruses show that viruses, as the climate changes, mutate, their RNA and DNA alters. And so when that happens, we have no resistance to these, as is the case with the COVID-19. And therefore, we can expect to see other mutations of viruses, and we're going to have more of these pandemics. And they're going to come at the same time that climate change is occurring and driving huge migrations. I gave a presentation at a medical conference, and I said to the medical conference, if you had 10,000 people who suddenly appeared in your city from another city who had all kinds of physical problems, or just normal ones like where would they get insulin for their diabetes, how could you handle it? And every single doctor I spoke with said to me, we couldn't. And if you look at what is currently going on in the United States today, you can see the stress that is being reported almost daily in the the nurses and doctors and orderlies and technicians who provide the health care. It is showing clearly that our healthcare system, which isn't really a healthcare system, it's a illness profit system, is not adequate to the task. And if you look at the world where we come to the end of the century and you've got 13 million people who are in migration in the United States, and as many as, well, the figures vary, anywhere from 50 to 150 million people worldwide, how are we going to deal with this? And I would suggest to you that the only way that can be dealt with is that we accept the idea that consciousness is causal and primary, and that, as Planck said, space-time arises from consciousness, not consciousness from space-time. And we begin to recognize we do not have dominion over the earth. We are merely one aspect of a great matrix of consciousness. We need to change our consciousness. That's just that simple. Now, how many people does it require? I mean, that seems to me to be one of the most pertinent questions. And the answer we know from research again is that when 10% of any cohort changes in consciousness, the whole cohort has to adjust to accommodate for that. So there's 333 million people in the United States. We can see what is happening when people don't accommodate to something that is factually accurate. The entire politicization of the mask issue, for instance, or if you look at the election that's going on where about 70 million people don't believe that we had a fair election, despite all of the research to the contrary, you can see the negative power of coherent consciousness. But if we look at other things, for instance, the change from gay to LGBTQ, if you do a Google word search, you discover that there was about 3 years ago, almost going on 4, there was a tremendous shift in the words used by people, and that people stopped using gay and they started using LGBT, and then it became LGBTQ. Nobody passed a law that said that had to happen. The president didn't appear on television speaking to the nation to say that. And yet it happened. Why did it happen? I would suggest to you because of collective intention. Culture is created by collective conscious intention. If we look at the Me Too movement or the Black Lives Matter movement, any of these things, or even go back a little earlier and we look at cigarettes. When I was a boy, and most of the people on this meeting, when you were young, you went to somebody's house, there was a coffee table, and on it was a ashtray and a pack of cigarettes, and one of those Ronson lighters your mother told you not to fool with. You never see it anymore. Not because somebody passed a law, not because somebody said that you couldn't do it. There was no public announcement, but there was enough scientific data that people took seriously, and they just quit smoking. And so the issue is, how do you get individuals to change in that way? And I want to suggest to you there is a very simple and straightforward way. I will call it the quotidian choice. Quotidian's a word most people don't know or don't use, but I chose it specifically because it stands out and it means mundane, ordinary, daily, simple things. And as a way of creating social change, if just the people who are taking part in this conference would make the following commitment, we as a group, as a seed crystal, as it were, could change the course of history. Every day, you make dozens of little choices. Most people aren't even aware they're doing it. They go to the market and they buy a toothpaste that their mother told them to buy or their college roommate told them to buy. They buy cat food or dog food because, well, that's what their mother bought. They don't hardly think about it. They go to gas stations, they buy a certain kind of gas. They don't think about it. But in fact, every one of those choices is an expression of consciousness. So if you, as an individual, will make the commitment that every day you make these choices, you will first of all become aware that you're doing it. And second of all, you will do research on your choices that you're faced with. And you will always pick, of the options available, the one that is the most compassionate, life-affirming, and fostering of well-being as you understand it at that moment. None of the choices may be great choices, optimal choices, perfect choices, but one of them is always slightly better, more compassionate, more life-affirming, more fostering of well-being than the others. And if you always choose that, and you tell 10 of your friends that you're doing it as a discipline, and invite them to join you in doing this, and to tell 10 of their friends to join them, you just do the math. It goes up very quickly. We have the power to create life-affirming change, and that's what needs to happen if we are going to deal with these existential crises that are coming: migration, pandemics, climate change, and the violence and war that climate change and fights over water are going to produce. Now, is there any actual evidence that this works? Let me give you just a couple of examples. Gandhi was a young barrister dressed in English clothes, thinking of himself as an English barrister in South Africa, and he went to get on a train and to buy a first-class ticket, which he felt he was entitled to. And they wouldn't let him do it because he was an Indian, therefore he was a non-white. This was during the apartheid period. And they made him ride in a third-class coach, and it really made him mad, and he made a fuss about it, and they put him in jail. And while he was in jail, he came across a little book called Civil Disobedience, which was written by Henry David Thoreau while he was in his little cabin near the pond, and it is a pond, Walden Pond. And he wrote of this little eccentric transcendentalist who people thought was a rather odd duck. He wrote this little book, and Gandhi read it and said, I'm going to go to India, and this is how we're going to get independence, nonviolent independence. And the day before, just a few days before he was assassinated in 1948, a reporter went up to him at his ashram and said, Gandhi, how were you able to force the British to leave India? How were you able to get one of the most powerful countries on earth to give up its most prized colonial possession? And Gandhi's answer speaks to this directly. He said, it isn't what we did that mattered, although that mattered. It isn't what we said that mattered, although it did matter. It was the nature of our character, our beingness, that led the British to choose to leave India. Note the difference between force and choose. Martin Luther King read about Gandhi and read about the civil disobedience book, and he got a copy and he read it. He was an anonymous Baptist preacher, and he said, this is how we're going to make the civil rights movement work. We're going to do it nonviolently. And so one eccentric 19th century transcendentalist sitting next to a pond who wrote a little book changed the course of history for three countries: India, the United States, and Great Britain. Never doubt that a single individual at the right place in the right time who chooses to foster well-being can change the course of history. And so I'm happy to speak at this conference because I hope that what I'm saying will get through to people and incite them to action. Because if we can do this, we can prepare for the existential crises that are coming. And if we do not do it, and we retain a materialist view in which we have dominion over the earth, and we can do things without consequences, we are facing a civilization-threatening crisis. The choice is up to us. If not us, then who? And if not now, then when? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stefan. The consummate pro, ending exactly on time, to many applause. The silent applause of Zoom. Do we have any questions? We've got some time. A few minutes. Tivi, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Tivi.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much. We just moved from one conference from England to another conference. I just seen you in the previous conference and moved to this one. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
First of all, I really enjoy your optimism, okay? I share it with you, but when you look into consciousness, I think it's something deeper. And as you know, it's another dimension. It's not just us. We are part of a bigger dimension.
Yes.
And when I'm here from London at what happened to America, and really, I'm not analyzing, I'm not going to all the details, but it's sometimes unbelievable that about 70 millions supporting a person that all of us knows about this person. I don't know how much people here support for him, but it's something unbelievable. That's what happened. And when I try to think why all this happened, I think it's something deeper. Because all the people, including you, who are very nice, etc., you're speaking with logic. But 70 million, or not all of them, but many of them, are very emotional. And still, if you look from global point of view, there is two opposites. The one consciousness, and the ego, the individual. And we've got, in each one of got part of both, okay? And depend how much doesn't matter why, more with the ego or want to be part of something bigger. You are part of the people who represent us to be part of the bigger conscious, part of the oneness. But Trump and many people like him are exactly the opposite. It's about us, it's about myself, it's how just I don't care about others. So still in America, you can see not 1 million, many millions that still in this consciousness. So first of all, I'd be delighted if what you're doing can help to convince all the other 70 million next time to be conscious, to help others to think about the other and not just from a egotistic point of view. So that's my question, how we can change it. I also, just to let you know, I very much believe in your approach, but you have to think more global. I'd be happy to collaborate with you because I'm developing technology exactly to help to change this. I'd be very happy to collaborate together with you and with Jeffrey about this. But my question is really, why do you think there is so many millions who are exactly the opposite, think just about themselves, about the ego, and how such person who is not so intelligent, by using the emotions, was so successful to have 70 million who support him? It's also another aspect of the consciousness, from the ego part, if not from the wholeness.
Well,
Let me add one more thing, Stefan, which is a question
Sure.
from chat, which says, does a life-affirming choice vary based on your worldview? And 2 minutes for your response to all of this.
okay. Well, first of all, Tuvi, I'm not sure that how you pronounce-
Yes,
Tuvi, you and I can contact off list about other things, but directly speaking to your question, you don't convert people. At least you don't convert them by forcing them, because that just creates violence. You change, you create this change by your beingness. You change, the choices that you make change. I mean, just think about it for a moment. If everybody made a decision, or not everybody, again, when 10% of the cohort, any cohort change, the whole cohort has to accommodate that change. So when you make choices that are life affirming, you don't confront people with it, but they experience what your choices create. And what needs to, the United States is currently threatened largely, I think, for two reasons. One, for 40 years, we have been telling ourselves that it's every man for himself. It's a complete contradiction to what the founders wanted and tried to create. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was what they said. And they recognized, because everybody was an immigrant or a descendant of an immigrant, that it would only work when the Scottish baker and the Italian blacksmith and the Irish, carpenter found common ground. That's why Benjamin Franklin, who is the first consciousness researcher in America, the first parapsychologist, the creator of the double-blind protocol, that was what he was trying to do with his creation of business groups and all of that. When you choose to create common intention that is life affirming, it changes the way things go. Right now, we are caught, as I said, in the issue of every man for himself, as opposed to seeing us as coming together to approach something collectively. And the other thing is, we are about to become a majority-minority country, where being white will no longer give you a get-out-of-jail card.